Re-Zero, Arc 7, Chapter 57b, I don't mind being called a moron.
Once she became unaware of Natsuki Subaru's whereabouts, Emilia panicked and made the biggest commotion of her life. "Emilia, please, Subaru. I really hope you'll be all right with Rem." The tempest of the shadows which attacked the Pleiades watchtower, that was when both Subaru and Rem were blown away. Nay, to be precise, it was not just those two. She knew there had been one more unknown component alongside them. That Emilia had gotten through that without losing her composure was because Beatrice and Ram, who had a connection to those two, had confirmed their survival. Of course, even if they were alive, the possibility they could come face to face with something dangerous or scary still existed. In fact, it was because he had to save the sleeping Rem in an unknown land, that it was definitely, absolutely assured that Subaru would act recklessly. However, because Subaru did not have Emilia, nor Beatrice with him, he must have been in quite the panic. "Emilia, I have to hurry and find them." With that resolution, Emilia and the group that had proceeded to conquer the Pleiades watchtower moved out. For starters, they had to find a way to enter the land to the south believed to be where Subaru had gotten blown off to, the Wallachian Empire, the country which had forbidden travel to and from the kingdom of Lagunica. We're gonna try and tackle this one from Kararagai. Security might be laxer in Kararagai in comparison, as Lagunica and Wallachia have been having a standoff. Those were Anastasia's words, promising to cooperate with the search for Subaru. Anastasia's group, of which Julius and Echidna were a part of, were believed to not have much to spare by any means, having had such a torrid experience at Pleiades watchtower, but that they had still offered to do that for Subaru's group, was something that made Emilia very happy. "Emilia, I'm very glad I became friends with Anastasia-san." "Anastasia, I think we're a wee bit different from friends. Like before, our positions'll stay that of rivals and whatnot. But, Emilia, Anastasia, after this Natsuki-kun royal selection business is all done and dusted, how about we become friends? I'm much like Emilia-san, in that I ain't got many friends." Saying so with a light-hearted attitude, Anastasia promised to lend her strength to them. Despite knowing that now was not the time, to Emilia, that promise the one for Subaru's search, was something she was also glad for. However, the day in which the fulfillment of her promise for them to become friends was one she longed for, and, if Anastasia Summer will devise a means to go through Kararagai, then us trying to use simply/you find a way through the Wallachian border would be the best plan, wouldn't it? Having reunited with Emilia and the others once they came back from Pleiades watchtower, Roswell, understanding the urgency of the situation, respected Emilia's desire to search for Subaru immediately. However, even using Roswell's rank and power, it appeared that entering the Wallachian Empire was not a matter so simple. And even should they fly in, it seemed flying dragons would gnaw at them. Even having earned Roswell's approval, entry into the Empire would not be easy. Above all, though it was called an empire, it was very large. Even if they somehow managed to cross into it, they did not know if they could find Subaru's group right away. In the middle of this increasingly agitating situation, a proposal to break this deadlock came from someone who yet again proved his reliability. About the way to get into the Wallachian Empire, I may or may not have an idea. However, it is not quite the commendable way, and there is some risk to it. So was stated, breaking the ice with some hesitation, by the one whose return coincided with the Emilia group's return home, Otto. That person, having stayed in the Watergate city of Pristella to recover, returned alongside Garfield, who had remained alongside him, and indicated a path towards hope for Emilia's group, who was greatly troubled over their challenge. However, those means were decidedly Otto, entering via smuggling. In Pikutat, one of the 5 great cities to the south of Lagunica. I may be able to prepare a means for you to enter from that city, my hometown. Entering through smuggling was the furtive passage into the nation, circumventing the regular procedures and arrangements. As Otto had said, it was not a very commendable method, and it was undeniable that it was quite the dangerous choice were they to be found. However, if there was no other way, "Emilia, we have to do everything we can for them." Stealing her strong resolve, Emilia conveyed her resolution to everyone else. Nobody said anything like "let's not" to Emilia's resolve, even Ram and Otto, who were under a lot of stress. Everyone prayed for Subaru's safety. Emilia was most proud of that, above anything else. No matter what it takes, we'll bring back Subaru safely. In fact, we will do it, I suppose. Emilia, yeah, that's right. Let's do our best. Her hand being gripped tightly by Beatrice's own, the one most anxious about the estranged Subaru, Emilia answered gently, by tightening her grip in return. And then, in Otto's hometown, going through a quarrel with Otto's old acquaintances that were after his life, going through Petra's handsome negotiations with the group who would smuggle them across the border, and aided by the bridal panic concerning Frederica's special constitution, the group searching for Subaru crossed the country, and, Emilia, that's enough. In the fortress city with madness swirling about, Emilia, who brought down snow, proclaimed so. Numerous buildings collapsed, as the once beautiful cityscape collapsed with nary a trace of it remaining. And yet, Emilia's anger only soared as she observed large figures moving left and right through the sky from afar, making complete use of their wings to crush the lives of people. Just how could they do such a terrible thing? Could there have been a better way to do it, and had they even made a proper effort at finding it? Nevertheless, even the one who believed this, Emilia herself, could not think of a way to halt the fight at this moment aside from using her own power, which was frustrating. That was why Emilia would be as frustrated as she could be, trying to not forget that feeling. To that end, Emilia, Ice Age, around Emilia, as she muttered this, the world started to lose its heat at a furious pace. The air slowly cooled, white snowflakes began falling gently from the chilling sky. Rapidly, without exemption, Emilia blanketed the city's perimeter with cold, with great care, adjusting the magic power, being cautious to not overdo it. She could not afford to err, and let the city turn to ice like the great forest of Elior, Emilia's homeland. Needless to say, even if she had thoughts of melting it later, to cool it down to the point of suspended animation, like Regulus's wives, was strictly forbidden. All Emilia had to do was to bring an unbearable ice season to lands unacquainted with the cold, those of the Empire. The biting cold wind, the falling white snowflakes accumulating, the white breath of the magical season of ice, would cover the fortress city struck by this flying dragon cataclysm. And then, Priscilla, dragonkind are weak against the cold. And when it comes to flying dragons, which have never known freezing cold, the harshness will be even more pronounced on their wings. With that, a figure leapt onto the half-destroyed wall on which Emilia stood, accompanied by the light sound of footsteps. Glancing over, Emilia then nodded with a yes. Emilia, before I took off, Petra-chan told me that flying dragons don't like the cold. She's really good at studying, and learned a lot about the Empire very quickly. Priscilla, so you relied on the wisdom of your servant? No wonder, you had me thinking it was a decent plan, for a half-devil devoid of wisdom. Emilia, there's no need for you to put it like that. Besides, how do you know that I'm a half-elf? Huh? And then Emilia rounded her amethyst eyes, her lips forming a pout because of how the other person had spoken. A woman in a red dress, her long orange hair blowing in the cold wind. Her hairstyle was different from what she remembered, but there was Emilia. Priscilla. Why are you here? This isn't Lagunica, you know. Priscilla, I shall return you with the same thing. Although, I have an idea as to why you have set foot in the Empire. How did you cross into the country? Emilia, oh, the method is a secret. I'm not supposed to tell you. I'm also supposed to hide who I am. So I have to be careful. Emilia was surprised to see Priscilla, a woman she had never expected to lay eyes upon in this foreign country to the south, yet she was strangely moved by the sight of her. However, she could not stay just being surprised there. The manner through which Emilia had entered the Empire was an irrational act, something labeled as a misdeed. Therefore, she did not want to make that clear to Priscilla unless necessary. But, Emilia, Priscilla, look out. Interrupting what she was about to say, Emilia prompted Priscilla to pay heed. The next moment, Priscilla, clicking her tongue, bounced away, and a furiously spinning blade, a flying winged blade, gouged out the spot she had been at. The battered, near-collapsed wall was cleanly sliced away by the sharpness of the blade, and conversely, it was miraculously spared from collapsing. Priscilla, having managed to avoid the blade, landed closer to Emilia this time, right next to her, the hem of her dress fluttering, and, Madeline, one after the other, just what are you people? The girl's voice, full of wrath, reached Emilia as the former caught the returning flying winged blade with a single hand. Looking down towards the destroyed cityscape, amidst it stood a horn-wielding girl, her bright eyes glaring at Emilia and Priscilla standing side by side. It seemed the one standing there was very angry. But Emilia was very angry as well. Therefore, Emilia jabbed her finger out toward the girl. Emilia, my name is Emily. Emily. I'm just a spiritual arts user passing through. Almost giving out her real name in the heat of the moment, Emilia succeeded in giving a false name that had been previously agreed upon. Priscilla's eyes narrowed at Emilia's boldness, and the little girl, to whom Emilia had introduced herself to, muttered, "Spiritual arts user," with a wary look in her eyes. "Madeline, you're the same as that dog girl, aren't you?" "Priscilla, if Arakia is the one you are thinking of, she is a spirit eater, not a spiritual arts user." "That would be a misconception, Madeline Eschart." "Madeline, gah." Priscilla's point was as if she had read the thoughts of the little girl of Madeline, which made the latter's cheeks become stiff. However, there had been something just now that Emilia could not help but hear more about. "Emilia, what is a spirit eater? What do they do with spirits?" "Priscilla, it is exactly as you have heard, she feeds on spirits. They take their power onto themselves and utilize it to the fullest. It is a practice near extinction, Arakia being the last remaining user in the Empire." "Emilia, they eat spirits? How awful." For Emilia, a spiritual arts user who had forged contracts with many micro-spirits herself, this was a bewildering thing to hear. If Puck or Beatrice were to meet a spirit eater, would their forms be gobbled up? Just thinking about it made her feel sorry for them. However, rather than worrying about such things that had yet to happen, the priority right now was the problem at hand. "Emilia, you're Madeline-chan? Madeline, do not belittle this dragon, you half-devil." "Emilia, then let's talk it through properly, Madeline. You're the one who's having those flying dragons attack the city. I want you to stop this, right this instant." Turning her gaze into the distance, Emilia looked out beyond the place Madeline had rampaged in, at a group of flying dragons resuming their assault on the other side of the city. Their movement seemed to be slower than they had been a moment ago, albeit slightly. Emilia's power was lowering the temperature, which was in turn affecting the vitality of the flying dragons. Were things to proceed in this manner, it would be possible to ground the flying dragons in the area. However, she wished to avoid doing that if possible. She did not want to have the flying dragons die, either. "Emilia, if you care about the flying dragons, then please listen to my request." "Madeline, Emilia, Madeline." As honestly as possible, Emilia tried to convey her words. Perhaps Otto, Ram, and Petra could have communicated better. But upon seeing the city being attacked by a flock of flying dragons, Emilia had been the only one to rush towards it. Now that Emilia had been first on the scene, she would do everything she could to help. As a result, "Madeline, it's awfully conceitful of you to make a request to this dragon, you human." She would do so even if it sparked Madeline's anger. "Priscilla, she cannot be persuaded by anyone, even were it not you. It is not an auspicious thing to listen to the words of a dragonkin, let alone one who is firmly grounded to the earth." Faced with Madeline's reply laced with outrage, Emilia held her breath upon hearing those words. Priscilla, who had been silently listening to the exchange between the two, expressed her observations regarding the breakdown in negotiations. Emilia widened her eyes, as that seemed to be encouraging her. "Emilia, Priscilla, I always thought you were so mean to me. Priscilla, I do not consider it wicked to say that that which is not worthy, is not worthy. Do not pervert my benevolent words. Now, how shall we go about this?" "Emilia, Nodding, Emilia created a hairclip of ice in her outstretched left hand. Presenting Priscilla with the hairclip, the latter closed one eye with suspicion. Towards Priscilla's reaction, Emilia nodded in assent, and, "Emilia, let's stop that girl together. Don't be mean. Priscilla, do not demean my deeds as a manifestation of childishness, you lowly half-devil." Striking back with an insult, Priscilla accepted the hair clip from Emilia's hand, then gathered her long, flowing hair, and fastened it in place. Hearing the clasp of ice clicking together, with Priscilla's mood returning to the one she was acquainted with, Emilia then turned to Madeline below, and, Madeline, sick of people who are fearless regarding dragons. Emilia, I just had a fight with a big dragon a while ago. So, Madeline, HK, Emilia, even if you wanted me to be scared, I can't be scared of you. Madeline's threat as she brandished her white fangs was given a clear-cut answer by Emilia. Immediately afterward, Madeline's eyes narrowed like those of a ground dragon, and the flying winged blade in her hand was hurled ferociously, targeting Emilia and Priscilla with tremendous momentum and speed. Witnessing its spinning approach, Emilia created a large hammer of ice, holding it in both hands. Emilia attempted to repel the revolving flying winged blade with an upward swing of her hammer of frost coming from below. Emilia, higher, feeling a powerful recoil in both her hands. Emilia, rushing in, did her utmost possible with the upward swing of the icy mallet. Though just barely, she deflected the trajectory of the flying winged blade, which passed over the heads of both Emilia and Priscilla, but the ice hammer shattered with incredible force, and Emilia looked down at her hands, speaking, Emilia, so strong. Maybe stronger than I am. Madeline, of course. It is wrong to compare the dragon, to people using the same standard. The petite form of Madeline stepped forward in triumph over the pained Emilia. Only for a block of ice more massive than the city hall to come crashing down on Madeline's head. Madeline, HK, the sudden appearance of the mass of ice, coupled with its size and weight, caused Madeline to be at a loss for words. Then her figure was flattened. Shockwaves of cold surged in all directions, centered on her, white winds blowing away debris and crumbling buildings, eliciting tremendous destruction. Priscilla, how dare you destroy this city? Emilia, huh? But it was already destroyed. Priscilla, you have a rather superficial way of looking at things. I am sure that manservant must be very weary. Nevertheless, you will finally understand. Emilia, finally, understand? Looking at the spot where the ice block had fallen, Priscilla crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. Emilia cast a question towards her profile, yet the answer arrived simultaneously, from Priscilla's lips, and from the spectacle in front of her. The ice block that should have crushed Madeline against the ground, trembled slightly, as a loud sound akin to that of the world cracking, began to echo from within the ice block itself. It originated from the piece of ice that was supposed to have made ground, from where the girl had stuck her arm in the air at the point of impact. Priscilla, just how troublesome Dragonkin can be. Immediately after Priscilla's words, the long block of ice broke in half with a thunderous roar. The impact of the destruction was felt throughout the entire area, and the shattered ice turned into mana particles starting from the outside. Amid this scenery of ice shards scattered about, the very incarnation of a dragonkin, leapt towards the duo with a roar. Freezing winds raged, beautiful women danced across the battlefield where the throngs of destruction roamed. Were anyone to witness the battle from afar, they would not have believed their eyes due to the sheer majesty of it. Was it reality, or was it merely a dream? Madeline, with enough force to shatter the ground she was standing on, the small dragonkin threw swirling death. A flying blade of destruction traced an arc, with beauty that betrayed the atrocious danger it brought forth. It cleaved everything in its path, it severed, it tore through the world. Had this been a painting, or even a beautiful pruning of the world, rather than destruction, it would have been a beautiful sight for anyone's eyes to behold merely based on aesthetics. Madeline Ischart's anger was refined, instinctual rage, to that much of an extent. However, Emilia, Priscilla, go up. A heavenly beauty of dancing silver hair created footholds of ice in midair, dodging the flying winged blade thrown at her, then waving her hand down towards the ground. The streets, lost of their original form, froze over. Rising from the frozen earth, was a beautifully adorned sword of frost. A beautiful princess, running as she made her way through, pulled it from the earth in a fluid movement, and, Priscilla, the fingers of anyone but me would have fallen off. But the embellishments are acceptable. I shall utilize it. A pale blue slash of ice flashed, slashing through Madeline's body diagonally. However, Madeline, with whatever kind of power was concealed within her petite body, only recoiled slightly upon being struck by the blow. Instead, the ice sword that had delivered the blow shattered, and after that, The approaching Madeline reached out a hand to Priscilla, and, Emilia, higher. Not allowing that act of violence to go unchecked, Emilia's 2 feet hit Madeline as she fell from directly above, both her feet encased in ice as she spun and drove a blow from up high. Emilia smashed into Madeline's 2 shoulders with a merciless attack, causing the sturdy girl to totter a step back. In that instant, Emilia, please, Priscilla, do not tell me what to do. After Emilia landed on the ground and put her hands, Priscilla took the newly created pair of ice swords and leapt over the crouching Emilia to slash at Madeline. The frost blades in Priscilla's right hand and left hand each came at Madeline from different angles, yet were quickly caught by the latter with the claws of her outstretched hands, causing a high-pitched clanging sound to echo. Madeline, don't push your luck, Emilia, ere. Having dealt with the twin swords, Madeline was about to go on the counter when an icy spike passed right next to Priscilla's head. Madeline immediately leaned forward, while Emilia, switching places with Priscilla, fired an ice spear with speed that could not be gauged by human eyes. Priscilla, my turn. Once Madeline shrugged off the spear, Priscilla followed it up with an icy sword dance. The hem of her red dress fluttered, the twin sparkling blue ice swords were swung gracefully, and Priscilla's swords dance among the glaciated world of white pummeled Madeline's entire body, forcing her back. Madeline, why is it like this? So exclaimed Madeline, while being forced to deal with Priscilla's twin swords, now on the defensive. But Priscilla's onslaught did not slow down. And to make matters worse for Madeline, once Priscilla ceased her swords dance, Emilia, this and this. Higher. Making full use of extraordinary reaction speed, Emilia, leaping out without sparing Madeline time to breathe, created ice weapon after ice weapon, to slam them down with all her might. Priscilla was the skill, Emilia was the brawn, and through them, Madeline's offensive and defensive capabilities were shut down completely. The flying winged blade cleaved, smashed, swung, was thrown. The innate physical abilities of a dragonkin were incomparable to those of a frail human. Even a demi-human, who was relatively more robust compared to a normal human, was as good as a dried-up twig before a dragonkin. The same was true even for the Oni race, which, abhorrent as it may seem, would be able to stand on the same ground beside the dragonkin. Dragonkin and the Oni were sometimes spoken of alongside each other as the strongest of races, but that was something outrageous. After all, the Oni were merely a race superior among demi-humans. Dragonkin were fundamentally different from them. Dragonkin were not demi-humans. They differed from those species related to the human race at a basic level. Dragonkin did not belong to mankind. But why was it playing out like this nevertheless? Madeline, what are you people? What are you? Leaving her offense to her anger and continuously failing to connect a blow, she had finally used up all her anger. And so, after the dragon's wrath was spent, all that remained was the dragon's creaking wail. The flying winged blade in her grasp was swung sideways, Emilia ducked, and Priscilla dodged it with a jump. Then, from both above and below, the 2 sides answered Madeline's wail at the same time. What are you? She had inquired. Emilia, Emily, Priscilla, it is myself. An upraised great axe of frost and 2 flashing blades of ice all scored a direct hit on Madeline. The sharp horns upon her head struck by blades of ice, and her torso slammed by a fierce blow from an axe of frost. Madeline was sent flying, unable to stop those blows. During her struggle, Madeline's body bounced once, then twice, high in the air above a thin layer of snow, and without losing velocity she plummeted into a pile of debris, for a white plume of smoke to then rise accompanied by a loud crash. Madeline, having left Madeline's hands, the flying winged blade pierced the wall behind her, and thus, the wall's role of protecting the fortress city from threats to the south now came to an end. With one last look at the walls collapsing with a loud thud, Emilia slowly rose to her feet, looking guardedly at the pile of rubble under which Madeline had been buried. Emilia, I suppose we did it. Priscilla, there was fitting recoil. Seems somewhat lacking, unfortunately. Emilia, right? Priscilla stepped forward next to Emilia, the latter tilting her head as she watched the twin swords in Priscilla's hands turn to dust. For some reason, she could not help but look at Priscilla's mouth, though she had not eaten anything. Priscilla met Emilia's gaze with her crimson eyes, and spoke. Priscilla, is this really all there is to someone that is not only a dragonkin, but one of the 9 divine generals, is what I am saying. Emilia, what are those 9 divine generals, and what's a dragonkin, too? That's a demi-human, right, Priscilla, a race stated to have died out long ago. They were said to possess the ability to communicate with dragons, a race no longer to be found in this world, but I guess that is merely a superstitious myth. Emilia, dragons. Does that mean they can talk to Volcanica as well? They're a bit out of it. At Emilia shyly attempting to break the ice, Priscilla raised her eyebrows. She then gently pressed a finger to her mouth. Priscilla, I never thought such words would come out of your mouth. Are you perhaps mistaking something, Emilia? Oh, are you maybe thinking I'm joking? I'm not joking at all. I met with Volcanica a little while ago actually, but they were all out of it because they had been alone for so long. Emilia hurriedly defended herself from Priscilla's reaction of disbelief. But Emilia quickly remembered her priorities. Speaking now's not the time. Emilia, now that we've beaten her, Madeline needs to stop the flying dragons. Priscilla, considering this cold weather, all these slow-moving flying dragons shall be hunted down in due time. Emilia, and there'll be people in danger in the meantime, still. Even Subaru and Rem could be in danger. Priscilla, Emilia leapt out from beside Priscilla, heading toward the rubble under which Madeline had been buried. Behind Emilia's back, Priscilla furrowed her shapely brow at the exchange that had just transpired. That reaction, however, went unnoticed by Emilia, whose long legs straddled the debris. Fashioning a shovel from ice, she thrust it into the rubble in an attempt to dig up the buried Madeline. Nevertheless, Priscilla let out a small exhale as she watched her back. It was a good thing that the grand move that had arrived unexpectedly had resulted in lesser consequences. However, the enormous damage caused by Madeline and the flying dragons was not something they could get rid of. Worst-case scenario, they would have to consider relocating their base to the demon city of Chaos Flame and relying on her collaborator, High Countess Serena Drakroy, to aid them. Priscilla, in any case, we shall first have to make her fold up her wings. Pausing to ponder about what laid ahead, Priscilla peered up to the white, cloudy sky. With the immense quantity of mana Emilia possessed, albeit it possibly had a limit as to its range, she still had enough power to alter the climate, meaning that she had a multitude of ways to make use of her power. Of course, what was valued in Wallachia was not necessarily valued in Lagunica. Rather, if she did decide to live in Wallachia, it probably would not end up being a waste of time. But, her nature aside, Emilia's personality was one that would not permit her to live in Wallachia. Priscilla. So, as Priscilla drew thoughts in the sky, her eyes flickered dimly. Those jewel-like crimson eyes flickered, as they had perceived a slight disturbance in the skies above. Then, just as Priscilla understood the nature of that disturbance, Emilia, there you are. Madeline, I'll get you out now. But please be a big girl, and tell us your story. Madeline, Emilia? Having found the little girl buried in the rubble, Emilia utilized the ice shovel to dislodge the building's remains. The dragonkin girl was lying on her back, herself and her clothes covered in soot and snow, dirtied. Emilia listened carefully, as the girl's lips moved and a faint voice escaped, hoping for words that accepted defeat, that would make the flying dragons retreat. However, Emilia's hopes were dashed. What Madeline's lips weaved was no declaration of defeat, only one word was muttered. A name, Madeline, Mazoya. The very next moment, the roar of a dragon originated from above the clouds rained down destruction onto the land. The instant the white beam of light was fired from the heavens, Emilia and Priscilla both sprung into action at the same time. Without any sound or warning, a tower of ice sprung into being, growing from the ground. 2 beauties of silver and crimson jumped atop. The tower had risen up to be over 10 meters tall in an instant. Standing on its summit, Emilia raised both of her hands up to the sky, conjuring forth a huge dome of ice which covered the area where the white beam was expected to impact, and within the conjured dome, another, yet smaller dome was added, and then, yet another smaller dome was added, and so this went on, until 6 domes of ice covered the sky. As Emilia set up their cover made from ice and snow, Priscilla stretched out her lustrous fingers into the sky and drew out the yang sword, which took the void as its sheath. The treasured sword was adorned with many eye-catching jewels and had a bright red radiance to it. However, the light brimming from inside remained feeble, nowhere near from how it was at its peak. Even so, Priscilla took up her treasured sword and looked up overhead. The very next moment, the looming white beam of light crashed against the outermost dome, and in less than a second, it pierced through the first, second and third domes, racing towards the ground. However, it would be wrong to say that the domes that had been pierced and broken through had not fulfilled their purpose at all. The moment the beam went through them, its angle changed slightly. There were only slight changes with the first, second and third one, yet those became heftier with the fourth and fifth one. Finally, the instant the sixth one was broken through, the beam's manner of entry had certainly changed. The white beam raced straight down towards the tower of ice, towards the two who stood at its pinnacle, and so to meet it, came a deep crimson shimmer, which beautifully, vibrantly morphed into a flash of resistance, and thus, was it unleashed? All sound completely disappeared. For the first time in his life, complete silence could be savored, for what seemed like 10 seconds. Perhaps it lasted for less than a second in actuality, but once that burst, the spreading shockwave, originating from the southern portion of the city, engulfed the fortress city in all directions, and everything flipped over. Ground rose from the surface, as buildings were ripped from their foundations. Those without shelter were blown away like dead leaves, and even the flock of flying dragons soaring in the heavens were assailed by the tempest. Without mercy, without bias, the shockwave which engulfed everything bore down on everyone in the city. Naturally, Flop, who was running around to treat the injured in the city's largest mansion, having been turned into a temporary treatment center containing those injured, was also rocked by the impact, being thrown back against the wall. Flop, who, as far as he could comprehend, it could have been a few seconds, or a dozen seconds, or even a few minutes, he felt a powerful impact on his back that made it feel as if all of his internal organs were being turned inside out. He did not register much pain, but the possibility that the pain would come later, or he might have suffered from something it being so painful he could not feel anything, also existed. If that were actually the case, he would have liked to go on with his uneventful life, watch his little sister medium lead a safe and happy life, savor the sense of accomplishment that he would have achieved in successfully taking revenge on the world, and stay unaware of it until he was old and on the verge of dying. Once there, it should be impossible to distinguish whether he had died from his wounds or from old age. Flop, let's see, maybe it isn't too serious. Being extra careful, he would raise his body after carefully assessing his own condition. His arms and legs moved, and every single one of his fingers were still on his hands. He seemed fortunate enough to not be missing his ears or nose, and his eyes had not been crushed either. He could not let his guard down, but he should not be overly pessimistic either. Shaking his head, Flop stood up, wiped his blurred eyes and gazed at his surroundings. The once stately and magnificent decorations had been changed entirely from what they were before, and the inside of the mansion had become a hellscape dominated by the smell of blood and the sound of groans. Add to that the shockwave that had just hit, and the grim situation of the site became even grimmer. Some of those who had been treated may have had their pain rekindled or made worse by the shockwave. They needed to ease their pain, to give them a helping hand.
Flop, I wonder if Butler-kun and Miss Utakata are okay too.
Leaving Priscilla to deal with Madeline, whom they had encountered, Flop and the others joined up with Rem in the mansion and helped deal with the wounded as best they could. He had also helped with that, while worrying about Priscilla and Schult, the latter's eyes still ablaze even after he managed to calm himself down somehow. Flop would not be able to rest in peace if it had all come to nothing due to that explosive impact. Rem, what in the world is? As Flop looked around at the state of his surroundings, he heard a voice speak in a pain-filled tone. Directing his eyes towards that voice, he saw Rem, peeking out from the depths of the hall. She was one of the people who had been attending to the seriously wounded who were in dire need of healing magic, and also one of the people who had been rendered astonished by the crash from just before. Rem, grimacing as she held her cane, looked out the window to see what had occurred. Flop, too, was alarmed, wondering if something more terrifying than a flock of flying dragons or one of the 9 divine generals going on a full-fledged rampage had happened. And right after that, Rem, how terrible, Rem's eyes widened and her expression turned grim, panicking as she rushed towards the mansion's door. Flop shouted Mrs. at her back as she rushed out, wondering what she had seen outside. Despite his aching sides and knees, Flop chased Rem as she rushed outside. As she reached the front garden of the mansion, she crouched beside a fallen figure. It was yet another injured person, someone who had been flung outside by the earlier impact. As he approached the crouching Rem, who was confirming the state of the figure, Flop now understood the dreadful effects of the impact from earlier, which he had not been able to see from within the mansion. Flop, this is. Flickering, white snowflakes were falling upon Garrel. The southern sky was covered with layers of thick clouds, through which the sun's rays were pouring down. Exhaling white breath, Flop shivered at the almost fantastical sight. Suddenly, the temperature in the surrounding area had dropped dramatically, and to boot, a sight as spectacular as this currently unfolding. Even in a dream, such a scene would be hard to materialize. In other words, Flop had shook his head, thinking that it was not a dream. Paradoxically, Rem, Flop-san, please help me. We need to carry this girl inside. Flop, yes, of course. Even under this mysterious sky, we can only do what we're able to get done. We've got to do the best we can. Turning around, Flop tried to help Rem. Then, halting his speech mid-sentence, Flop widened his blue eyes. The reason was obvious, and it laid to Rem's back, who was asking for his help. The figure behind Rem, having been blown away by the earlier impact, and whom Rem had suggested they should take inside the mansion for medical attention, was a small one. It was small and dainty, possessing twin black horns on her head. Then, perhaps dazed, the girl slowly raised herself up behind Rem, about to casually swing her arm adorned with sharp claws. Flop. Once again, Flop experienced the sensation of sound fading away, of the flow of time becoming distorted. As she was looking towards him, Rem was unaware of the threat that loomed behind her. That very threat, the girl, seemed to be acting out of defensive instinct rather than out of an actual intent to hurt Rem. She must have gone through a terrible experience. He sympathized with her, but it was something unfortunate and unmanageable that would not change with sympathy. Flop, Kuna and Holly, in charge of guarding the mansion, would probably take a while to recover from the impact from earlier. There was no sign of the girls within sight. He could not count on them to deal with this. Schult, his eyes in a conflagration, Otakata, who had been assisting with medical treatment and supporting the fighters' morale, even Heinkel, who had fainted and would not wake up, none of them could be counted on to help them either. When he closed his eyes, he could see his little sister, at the back of his eyelids, smiling. He was proud of his sister, who had sworn to herself that she would become so strong that her brother would never be hurt. Multiple figures, that of his benefactor, and of his sworn brother, those who had given him and his sister the chance to go out into the world, passed through his mind. Treasure your life, Flop. Self-sacrifices for morons. Once before, his benefactor had laughed at Flop's reckless way of life. At this moment, Flop would state the same thing he had back then. Flop, I don't mind being called a moron, because all those who loved him had clapped their hands and laughed at his answer. Rem, Flop saw. He stepped in, and with an outstretched hand, pushed on Rem's slender shoulders, putting her out of harm's way, and, in the path of that swinging claw, that moron wedged himself instead. Blood sprayed, and Flop O'Connell fell to the cold ground.